We are ready to go. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Tackling Invasive Species, Not Your Everyday Challenge. My name is Andrew Holland and I'm with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'm our National Media Relations Director and I'm your moderator today. I'd like to start by stating that we at the Nature Conservancy of Canada respectfully acknowledge that the work we do across the country is on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Working together with donors, organizations, governments, and Indigenous communities, the Nature Conservancy of Canada has helped to protect 14 million hectares or 35 million acres of critical lands and waters from coast to coast to coast. Our NatureTalks events work to engage audiences in urgent conservation topics and by bringing communities together to share knowledge and enhance connections. Before we begin, we have some quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive a link to the video after the event, and we encourage you to share it. You are welcome also to ask questions. Simply type it in the Q&A chat box and include who the question is for, and we will answer it at the end of the webinar. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Gabby Nichols, the Programs Coordinator at the Canadian Council of Invasive Species. Gabby coordinates social communications and the Council's 6 Take Action campaigns to promote Canadians to take actions to stop the spread of invasive species. Paula Noel is the Program Director for New Brunswick at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Among many duties, she helps to advance invasive species prevention and management throughout the Maritimes through her role at NCC and on invasive species councils. And Eric Cleland is the Ontario Region's Director of Invasive Species Program at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Eric leads Canada's largest invasive Phragmites control program in partnership with the provincial and federal governments. Right now, I'll pass it over to Gabby to kick things off.
Thanks, Andrew, for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Gabby Nichols and I'm the Programs Coordinator at the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. My talk today will cover what invasive species are and how they are spread, and then I'll hand things over to Paula and Eric to provide some examples of invasive species removal projects. At the end of their talks, I'll be back to share what you can do to help prevent the spread in Canada. So just a little bit of background on the Canadian Council for those who might not be aware. We act as the national voice and hub to protect Canada from the impacts of invasive species. We're guided by a diverse board with representatives from government, industry, business, Indigenous organizations, and chapters which are represented by invasive species councils from across Canada to really give us that cross-country view on invasive species issues. And then our main objective, or one of our major objectives, is to collaborate with partners to deliver pathway-focused tools and resources that stimulate Canadians to take action on invasive species. So what are invasive species? So a typical definition for invasive species are plants, animals, and microorganisms, including diseases that have been accidentally or deliberately introduced into areas beyond their native range, and that negatively impact either the environment, the economy, or society, including human health. And it doesn't have to hit all of those categories, but the sort of worst invasive species are the ones that hit most of those. So a couple of examples of invasive species in my area of Ontario right now, I'm sure many of you are experiencing gypsy moth caterpillars. They defoliate trees and really impact our trees, our environment, but also property values as well. Giant hogweed is another one. This is a species you often hear in the news. It's sap if it gets on your skin, and then that is exposed to sunlight can cause some pretty bad burns. So that's one that impacts human health. And then we have garlic mustard, which is a species sort of found mostly across Canada in people's backyards, as well as along trails. And as you can see from that picture, can really outcompete native species and just take over an understory of a forest. So really bad impacts there as well. So as I mentioned, the Canadian Council is very pathways focused. Pathways are the means and routes by which invasive species are introduced. So there's a couple of examples there. These are not by any means a fully inclusive list. There's many ways that invasive species can spread. But the reason that we focus on pathways is that we can really be proactive when we focus on pathways and focus on preventing the species before they cause a lot of cost to the environment, to the economy, and to society in the future. So to give a little bit of background on that, I've included here a invasion curve. So this is just one of many examples, but if you look to the bottom left, you can see that once an invasive species is introduced, as time goes on, the area it affects as well as the management costs continue to grow and increase. So it's far more efficient, far less costly for the environment and for the economy to actually prevent and eradicate new infestations. So the earlier we catch it, the less costly it is for everyone and the environment. And just a couple of examples. You can see here is kudzu. So it's an invasive species of vine known as the vine that swallowed the South in the United States. So far, it's just found in Ontario in one location to my knowledge. And it's actually very invasive. You can see it from this picture. It's kind of beyond the point of no return. They're just going to be throwing money to manage it, to keep it kind of intact or managed and the population small. So this vine can actually grow 25 to 30 centimeters per day in good growing conditions, so very invasive. And then another example you can see on the left is a row of street trees, ash trees actually, which have been impacted on the right-hand side by emerald ash borer, an invasive insect that is transported through wood that's contaminated. And you can see that it's had a really devastating impact on this neighborhood, affecting property values, affecting our forests and our lumber industry as well. And thanks for listening. I'm going to pass the mic over to Paula to provide a bit more background.
Okay, thank you for that, Gabby. As was mentioned, my name is Paula Noel, and I'm the Program Director for New Brunswick with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I'm also a volunteer director with Canadian Council on Invasive Species, as well as with the New Brunswick Invasive Species Councils, which is one of their chapters. And I'm happy to be here today to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that we're facing here in Atlantic Canada in relation to invasive species. So we've been pretty lucky here in Atlantic Canada. We are very lucky. We've got a lot of intact habitat. We still have a lot of high forest cover across our region. And these intact habitats have made Atlantic Canada more resistant and resilient when it comes to invasive species. So compared to a lot of the rest of the country, especially compared to some areas of southern Ontario and Quebec, we have not had to worry as much or have had the high profile challenges and problems from invasive species that have faced other regions of Canada for decades now. But however, we are seeing that change. There's been recently some high profile invasive species that have made it into our region, that are raising people's awareness, that are causing damage to biodiversity. They're impacting habitat and directly threatening species at risk. And as you'll see, sometimes directly leading to species becoming listed. One big example of that is white nose syndrome in bats. White nose syndrome is a disease that affects hibernating bats, and it's caused by an invasive fungus. It was first noticed in New York in 2007 and was spread to New Brunswick by 2011, and it's now found in all provinces from Manitoba east. It affects numerous bat species, but 3 in particular have been devastated by white nose syndrome, causing them to be listed as species at risk of extinction in Canada. They are the little brown bat, or myotis, the northern myotis, and the tricolored bat, which are shown here on the cover of a federal recovery strategy. This fungus occurs in Europe and Asia, but it doesn't kill the bats there. The bats here in North America, however, have no natural immunity to the fungus, and that's why it's causing so much damage. Another species that Gabby had mentioned and showed you some of the damage that has been done is emerald ash borer. This tiny insect has had a huge impact on our forests, killing tens of millions of ash trees. And similar to the situation with the bats, it's caused once very common ash trees to be placed on endangered species lists. Up to 99% of all ash trees are killed within 8 to 10 years once this beetle has arrived in an area. And emerald ash borer just reached the Maritimes in 2018, and it's now found in several locations across New Brunswick and also in the Halifax region. As Gabby was mentioning, and we'll tell you a little bit more about, you can all help prevent the further spread of these destructive species by adopting the programs that the Canadian Council on Invasive Species is promoting. Not all invasive species cause these tremendous impacts on individual native species. Invasive plants, for instance, have broad habitat impacts where they take over an area and prevent other plants from growing, impacting the wildlife that depend on these native plants and changing the habitat structure. One example of this that has a better ending than the ones that we were just talking about is purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife beetles eat nothing. Eat nothing but purple loosestrife. They are also not from North America, but after extensive research on these beetles, they were brought here and released at wetlands in the 1990s. And as a result of these experiments, they showed that purple loosestrife was reduced in those wetlands where the beetle was released by as much as 90%. Native marsh vegetation naturally reestablished in its place and proved that with the right tools available, habitats can be reclaimed from aggressive invaders like purple loosestrife. By the time this invasive plant reached Atlantic Canada, scientists were ready and released the beetles at the same time. And so while it does grow here in Atlantic Canada, it hasn't had the same major impacts that it had in Ontario in the 90s. Purple loosestrife can still have local impacts when it gets too abundant, and so we do pull it before it goes to seed, as you can see happening here in the NCC Blooming Point Nature Reserve in the North Shore of PEI. NCC also sits on the Invasive Species Council on PEI, where we are working with partners to develop best management practices and coordinate management, disposal, and reporting of invasive species in Prince Edward Island and in the other maritime provinces. For NCC and partners on Prince Edward Island and indeed the rest of Atlantic Canada, one of the most concerning general issues is setting priorities for controlling invasive species, some of which are already widespread, but are causing particular problems in nature reserves protected by NCC. We've also found that there's a lack of data often on the impact and threat of invasive species in coastal habitats. One example of this is the perennial sow thistle, which is a typical field weed that's taking over some beach and dune areas and edges of coastal marshes. The deep dune grasses that are critical at holding the sand in place on these very dynamic habitats are threatened when sow thistle moves in with its very shallow root systems. When it competes with and crowds out native dune grasses, there is a threat to the whole system being destroyed. NCC is collaborating with Parks Canada to remove and control sow thistle in coastal habitats in Prince Edward Island, and you can see a picture there from one of our removal events. Another widespread invasive plant in our region is Japanese knotweed. This is a bamboo-like plant that grows in enormous monocultures that crowds out all other plants and is so thick that wildlife can't feed, nest, or even move through a stand of this plant. At our Johnson's Mills Shorebird Reserve in New Brunswick, our staff have been successfully controlling this plant by tarping, cutting, and pulling it, but it is a threat more broadly across the region, especially where it grows along rivers and streams. Currently in Nova Scotia, NCC's most concerning invasive issue is the hemlock woolly adelgid. This is a forest pest. It affects eastern hemlock trees, and eastern hemlock are a long-lived, slow-growing tree, and there are incredible old-growth stands of hemlock across the Maritimes. Mature hemlock forests provide important habitat for wildlife. They support over 400 species of arthropods, plus mammals, birds, and fish-bearing streams. Hemlock woolly adelgid was discovered first in southwest Nova Scotia in 2017. And while this pest doesn't kill trees as quickly as the emerald ash borer, over time it will destroy these old forests if nothing is done. NCC is a partner in a provincial working group led by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And so we're developing with this group a strategy on how to address and control the spread of this species in Nova Scotia and across the Maritimes. There has been success with releasing natural predators of the adelgid in the US, and our hope is that these treatments will become available in Canada before too much damage occurs. In the meantime, NCC will be deploying survey protocols at select nature reserves this year. Hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring and detection will become a regular part of our property monitoring, and as well staff will be collecting seed for future restoration if there is an impact on hemlocks from this species. This next one might be a surprise to some people, but moose are actually an invasive species in the island of Newfoundland. Moose were introduced in the late 1800s, and shortly thereafter, their main native predators, the Newfoundland wolf, was extirpated from the island. As a result, their population exploded and resulted in compositional and structural shifts in forests across the island. Many hardwood species and balsam fir have been particularly hard hit. And in extreme cases, this has resulted in moose meadows, which are fields of stunted fir that can't reach escape height due to continual overbrowsing by the moose. Moose exclosure studies in Terra Nova National Park showed the impact of moose browsing on forest regeneration, and NCC has studied the impact of moose on forests in our Salmonier Nature Reserve. We're currently looking at the feasibility of combining management techniques to help the scale of restoration across the landscape that we're trying to address. And the methods that we will use will probably be a combination of moose exclosures and reforestations. And you can see in this photo the dramatic difference between forest regeneration where the moose have been excluded by fencing compared to the control area. So this has just been a very small sampling of the work that Nature Conservancy of Canada is doing to address invasive species and their impact on wildlife and species at risk in Atlantic Canada. There are many, many more examples that I could give you, but we don't have that much time to go through them all. And we recognize that we can't do this work alone. Invasive species are a problem that extends across the entire landscape, and we're working collaboratively with organizations across our region through invasive species councils. There are currently active councils in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, and NCC staff have been involved in the establishment and growth of these invasive species councils, who are all working closely with the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. In the meantime, our focus on our NCC protected areas will continue to be monitoring and mapping invasive species so that we have an understanding of where they are, and so that we can detect new species moving into our region and address them quickly, as well as removal and management of species that are occurring in our nature reserves so that we can protect the habitat for the conservation values that for which we became involved in the first place in these areas. So that is just a little bit of an overview of the state of invasive species in Atlantic Canada. There's certainly many ways that the public can help us with these challenges. One way is to become a volunteer. You see here a volunteer event where people came out and helped us to pull invasive species on one of our reserves. In New Brunswick, you can find opportunities to volunteer on our NCC website. You can make donations, and all of the donations to NCC help us with all of our programs, including the management of our sites and protecting them from invasive species. And by becoming aware and involved in the behavioral programs promoted by the Canadian Council, which Gabby will tell us a little bit more about in a moment, you can also help to stop the spread of invasive species. And with that, I will turn things over to my colleague Eric to tell you a little bit about our work in Ontario.
Thank you, Paula. So again, my name is Eric Cleland. I am the Director of the Invasive Species Program with NCC in Ontario Region, and I'm going to speak to you today a little bit about our Phragmites Management Program and what we're doing to address this invasive plant in one particular region of Ontario and how we're hoping to grow this program across the province. For those who aren't familiar with the actual species at hand, invasive Phragmites is a tall perennial grass that spreads very readily by seed, by rhizome, and by stolon. So chunks of actual frag, stem, and roots can spread this plant rather quickly. It's a real concern for our wildlife, especially species at risk that inhabit our coastal and inland wetlands, because it forms these dense stands that are very tall and very inhospitable to all wildlife. They actually are very aggressive and grow quickly and chase out the native plants that used to colonize these sites as well. Some of the strategies that Phragmites uses to do this is it's actually allelopathic, so it essentially releases a chemical into the soil that prevents the germination of other competitive plants, while at the same time being a very strong nutrient user itself. So it actually uses most of the resources that its competition would need to thrive and grow in these environments. With all of these strategies working for it, it was named back in 2005 by the federal government as Canada's worst invasive plant. And of course, we consider it invasive and exotic here in Canada because it is a European native and doesn't have any natural controls within North America. So where did NCC start the battle against invasive Phragmites? Well, deep in the south part of southern Ontario, on a very diverse and protected peninsula out in Lake Erie called Long Point. Long Point is about 40 kilometers long and is internationally recognized as a provincially significant wetland, a Ramsar site, a World Biosphere Reserve, and home to over 25 species at risk. We started this project by first wanting to know where is the plant, and so we used aerial photography and reconnaissance with airplanes to determine approximately the extent of Phragmites in the coastal wetland complex of the Long Point region. You can see those shown here in yellowish orange on this map. And I'll just draw your attention to the size of area that we calculated originally back in 2015 when this program started. We thought we were dealing with about 1,300 hectares of plant within this area. Fast forward to 2020 though, and we now see that we have started our control program. It's been going for 5 years, and the areas in red is where we have worked. But when we actually began the actual operations on the ground, we found very quickly that the aerial photography grossly underestimated the area of coverage of Phragmites, and the problem was indeed much worse than we originally anticipated. So far to date, at the end of the 2020 control season, we've completed over 1,200 hectares of Phragmites management, but there still is at least 650 hectares to go within this region alone. So a little bit about our project and how it all got started. As was mentioned earlier, it is Canada's largest invasive Phragmites control program, and it's because we have the unique access through an emergency registration by the Federal Pest Management Regulatory Agency of a herbicide product called Roundup Custom, which can be used in aquatic environments. Roundup Custom has been used in coastal wetlands around North America for many years, however, not in Canada because regulations didn't allow it until recent years. Beginning in 2016, we started this partnership with the Provincial Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and it has continued on an annual basis and is still going here in 2021. One of the biggest strengths that has really made this project successful is the diversity of organizations and partners that have come together to help support this response. And that's everything from environmental organizations such as NCC and Ducks Unlimited and local Waterfowlers Association, but also the local communities themselves. So the local agricultural communities, the cottagers associations, even the local municipalities, all are impacted in some way, shape, or form by the spread of invasive Phragmites. For farmers, it could be in agricultural ditches and drainages or encroaching on fields. For cottagers, it's blocking viewscapes and aesthetics and reducing property values. And for environmental organizations, we're concerned about the impacts to biodiversity that it's having in some of these critically important habitats. So together, we brought all these organizations and created an alliance called the Long Point Phragmites Action Alliance, and we found that really the collaborative approach has been the most successful way to address this plant. Of course, dealing with a project of this size and using products like herbicides to take a more aggressive approach to managing this plant means we need to make sure we're taking all the steps absolutely necessary to ensure the responsible application of herbicide and that we're not having any undue and unforeseen impacts to the environment. So we struck a partnership with the University of Waterloo back in 2015 to do a comprehensive monitoring of everything that occurs involving the herbicide use of the project, including efficacy, fate of the herbicide in the water and the sediments at the base of the water bodies that we're applying it to, and changes in the vegetation community after applying the herbicide and seeing the resurgence of native vegetation in these areas. And lastly, it's important to note that we've had incredibly strong support from the public, from our Indigenous communities and partners on the landscape, and of course from our neighboring jurisdictions across the lake. Lake Erie has been benefited from significant Phragmites control programs on the American side, and Canada is now doing its part through this program. So the tools that we use for this particular work, there are three main methods for applying the actual herbicide as part of an integrated pest management program. We use aerial application through helicopters in remote areas where we can't access it with equipment and to minimize our footprint on the landscape where absolutely possible. We use amphibious track machines called Marsh Masters with licensed exterminators applying the herbicide in a very targeted fashion to small stands or specific plants where necessary. And we also use a shallow draft John boat to access very shallow wetlands and areas where the other two pieces of equipment aren't suitable. In addition to this, when working in close proximity to species at risk, we use backpack sprayers as necessary to make sure that we're minimizing our potential for impact. Of course, we talk a lot about the herbicide as part of this program, but really that's just one aspect of an integrated pest management program. We try to take all of the approaches necessary to make sure our impact is as high as possible. In the fall and winter months after the herbicide has taken effect, we come back to these sites and we roll them with our Marsh Masters to lay the standing dead stalks, known as biomass, down on the ground and create the perfect medium to conduct a prescribed burn when it's possible. The benefits of a prescribed burn are it resets the site for our native plants to recolonize after removing the Phragmites. So blackened soil increases the temperature, which allows the native plants to get an early jump the following season on any potential remaining Phragmites plants. Removing all of that dead biomass also has the benefit of allowing our team to go in and search for any plants that were missed in the initial herbicide control program and be very effective and strategic with applying very small amounts of herbicide for the follow-up treatment. And the good news is it works, and it works really, really well. So this photo shows a site where aerial treatment was completed, and only 18 months later we have extremely good colonization of native plants. We have arrowhead, pondweed, typha, and other species coming back in these areas where we would hope to have seen them prior to Phragmites invasion. So how do we take the lessons that we've learned from a landscape scale program at Long Point and apply it across the province? NCC has been very fortunate to have this partnership with the provincial and federal governments to deliver this program at Long Point over the last number of years. This opportunity has led to the authorship of a strategic framework for coordinated management for Ontario. This is the first invasive plant strategy written by the provincial government to address an invasive plant in Ontario, and NCC is very pleased to have been part of the authorship of this work. Taking this strategy to the next level will allow us to lay out the steps, including policy and legislative amendments that might need to be considered to enable province-wide control programs to begin, other implementation considerations such as logistics, needs for reaching out to the public, and outreach to other industries and communities that may be interested, as well as consultation requirements with our Indigenous communities. Where do we go from here? Well, for 2021, we have continued support from the province through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to refine the strategic framework and begin actual implementation on the ground. These are very exciting next steps for us, And we hope to establish 2 new regional-based programs that mirror the model used in Long Point in 2 other areas of Ontario further in 2021. And so that's a little bit about NCC's response to managing Phragmites across the province of Ontario. We've been very excited to have these partnerships with the provincial and federal government, and we look forward to continuing this work across the province. I'll turn it back now to Gabby to give us a little bit more on the national perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric and Paula, for the great presentation. So I'll just continue to kind of wrap things up here and give everyone a bit of information on what you can do to prevent the spread. So here's just a couple of the Canadian Council's Take Action programs, just a glimpse at them. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of the top 2, Clean, Drain, Dry and Play Clean, Go. But these programs, we work with partners across Canada to implement and basically help Canadians prevent the spread with tools and resources. And I'm very happy and excited to announce that the Nature Conservancy of Canada is actually our newest Play Clean Go partner. So we'll be working with them to implement Play Clean Go. Essentially, this program works to slow and stop the spread of terrestrial or on-land invasive species while people are enjoying the great outdoors. So to protect those valuable areas and work with other great teams across the country. So some examples of outdoor recreational pathways that spread terrestrial invasive species, you can see them listed here. Again, there's definitely more pathways than we see here: hiking, camping, biking, pets, horseback riding, off-road vehicles. But these are just a few examples of how invasive species can spread. So they typically seeds and plant pests can get stuck in the mud, to our clothes, to our shoes, our pets, our ATVs, our tires, and our bikes, and can be easily spread that way. So what are we actually spreading here? So here are just a couple examples. Again, there are far more invasive species out there that can be spread in terrestrial areas. Many of them are plants, but hemlock woolly adelgid is actually a small aphid-like insect that creates these white, fluffy, sort of Q-tip looking ovisacs that once the wind blows can really get caught in hair, can get caught on your clothes and your pet's fur and easily spread to new areas. Unfortunately, this pest is in Canada. It's actually in Nova Scotia, Kejimkujik National Park. As you can imagine, that park has a lot of visitors. So it can easily spread to new areas that way, impacting our eastern hemlock trees in eastern Canada. So not a great invasive species there. And then garlic mustard, I mentioned this one earlier. One garlic mustard plant can actually produce 600 seeds on average, and they're these tiny little black seeds. They're often along trails, so easily caught in people's boots in the mud there and spread to new areas, which is why it's so important to be aware of what you might be spreading intentionally or not. So what are we going to ask people to do with Play Clean Go? We're asking people to come clean and leave clean. So that means removing plants, animals, and mud from your boots, your gear, your pets, and your vehicles when you're out and about in natural areas, and to also clean that gear before you're visiting. So before you enter and then before you leave, so we're not spreading it to new areas. And another ask we have for people is to stay on designated roads and trails. A lot of invasive species tend to be along trails, and when we move off the trail, we're actually tracking those invasive species into those more pristine and untouched areas. So we really want to stay on trails just in case. And one last thing I want to ask, challenge people listening today, is to take the Play Clean Go pledge. You can go to playcleango.ca to do that. It just helps you commit to an action, and it helps your future self remember, hey, I said I was going to Play Clean Go, so I'm going to do that. So definitely encourage everyone listening to do that. And then I just wanted to quickly go over, there's other ways that you can prevent the spread of invasive species, not just on land. Our Clean, Drain, Dry program targets aquatic invasive species and encourages people to clean, drain, dry their watercraft, their fishing gear, basically anything that touches the water that could spread invasive species. A couple of examples of invasive species spread are Eurasian water milfoil. This is a really nasty one, creates really thick mats in the water, makes swimming really unpleasant. and also affects our aquatic life as well. Those thick mats kind of block sunlight and kill off our native vegetation in the waters. And zebra mussels is another example. Zebra mussels, it's often a big issue in eastern Canada. Their shells are very sharp when they go along beaches. They can often cut people's feet, but they also impact the functions of our aquatic ecosystems, can outcompete native mussels, and can even impact fishing or fish spawn areas. So lots of impacts there. We don't want to spread these species, so always clean, drain, dry. And lastly, I'm going to ask people to support early detection of invasive species. From that invasive curve, you saw that the earlier we detect it, the less cost for the environment, the economy, and society as well. So report your invasive species. If you go to reportcanadainvasives.ca, you can find a lot of these great tools that are listed there on the bottom: EdMaps, iNaturalist, and IMAP invasives, as well as reporting forms by province and territory, and some alert species programs as well. So definitely check that out to report invasive species in your community and spread the word on invasive species to help prevent the spread. And just to finalize, I'm happy to take questions now. And if you're looking for more information, you can visit the website down below on my slide. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabby. A lot of great information packed in there, certainly, and thanks to Paula and Eric as well for your presentations. We have several questions today. As a reminder, if you have a question that you have not yet submitted, please enter it using the Q&A chat box feature and let us know ideally who the question may be for. Otherwise, I'll do my best to direct it to whoever I think's the most appropriate person, and we'll certainly try to get through as many of these questions as time allows. The first question is from Chatham, Ontario. Huge outbreaks of all the nasties this year. Was it the weather the past few months? Mild winters usually mean bad summers for ickies, and I'm not sure if they're referring to the European gypsy moth. There's been a lot of news coverage about that, certainly in southern and midwestern Ontario in recent days and weeks. I'll put that out there to everybody. I wonder if that's what they're talking about, and is it because of mild winters that might be causing this?
I can take a stab at that, Andrew, if it's helpful. So thanks for the question. Yes, European gypsy moth has been infesting woodlots all across Ontario, not just in the deep southwest Chatham area. You're very right. Mild winters do not help in mitigating the impact. We do sometimes see egg mass die off in very cold climates and very cold winters for European gypsy moth, but we haven't had the luxury of that this past winter, unfortunately. The good news with gypsy moth, though, is it is a cyclical insect on about a 10 to 12 year cycle. So it's kind of a boom and bust, and right now we're just finishing the boom with this particular insect. So hopefully in the coming year or two, we'll be able to see a little bit of relief for our favored hardwood trees in the deep parts of southwestern Ontario, and hopefully this pest will back off. We do know it is a bit of a nuisance and can impact your enjoyment of the outdoors for sure. So thanks for that question.
The next one is from Mike. Will European leaf-eating beetle become a problem? So Gabby, Paula, I don't know which one of you just want to try to handle that one. Gabby, you want to take a stab at it?
Sure, yeah, I can take a stab at it. So a lot of invasive species, we don't tend to know how bad they're going to get. I talked about the invasive curve, but typically if something isn't managed, it may continue to get worse. I don't know if Paula wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that particular species, but often invasive species, there's a very long delay between when they first appear in a place and when they start to become a problem. And between those times, a lot can happen, a lot that we don't really understand ecology, the environment, it's very, very complex. And it could be things like a gradually warming climate make the conditions great for something to suddenly explode, or it could be that just populations need to build up to a certain level. And so a lot of things can impact that. And like Gabby says, there's a lot of species that are on kind of watch lists of invasive species councils across the country, but it's really hard to predict what's going to be the next big problem at any given time. And unfortunately, sometimes until it becomes a problem. So the best we can do is try and slow the introduction and spread of these non-native, potentially invasive species across the country.
The next question is from Jeff Carpentier, and I'm going to direct this one to Eric because it seems to be right in his general neighborhood of Norfolk County and some of our activities there. With non-native Phragmites, many municipalities inadvertently encourage its spread by poor roadside management techniques. Example, not following clean equipment protocols. Is the Nature Conservancy of Canada working with municipalities to educate and encourage them to control the spread? And I know, Eric, you and Kristen Bernard work quite closely in that area with many different partners and stakeholders, including the provincial government over that overall Phragmites program.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Jeff, for the question. Nice to see some local questions coming through today. Yes, we are working very closely with a number of different organizations, including municipalities, to help improve the use and adoption of clean equipment protocols. The Ontario Invasive Plant Council has a very well-written clean equipment protocol for industry document that's available for anyone that's interested in how to ensure that you're minimizing the opportunity for spreading seeds or parts of plants as part of large-scale construction or infrastructure type projects. And actually, one aim of the provincial strategy that we recently authored was to help spread the adoption of this protocol across the province and really make sure that folks are aware how important it is that we aren't actually inadvertently encouraging the expansion of these particular plants with our maintenance and our infrastructure projects. So definitely something we're working very hard towards, and hoping that we'll see greater adoption of across not just Ontario, but across the country.
The next question is anonymous, I guess, and I'm going to direct this one to Paula. And it's something that we hear from time to time, believe it or not. I used to think that we should get rid of all invasive species, but now I question its worth. I am now thinking ecological changes have always occurred, changing the fauna and flora to change with it over periods of time. Why do you persist we have to get rid of invasive species? Because I guess what the questioner, that's what the question is, but sometimes we hear that, is it worth the time and effort? Paula, if you want to try to answer that.
Sure. Yeah, it's an important question, and it's one that we at Nature Conservancy of Canada spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's actually part of our management planning on our nature reserves, is prioritizing what activities we're going to undertake, because obviously we've only got so many resources, we've only got so many people and so much funding to do the work that we do, and so where invasive species, particularly plants that we're looking at managing on our reserves, are really well established and are widespread in the surrounding area, we often do look at just monitoring and try to minimize the impact, but we won't try to completely remove them. Really what we're trying to focus our efforts on is preventing new invasive species from coming in, or reacting quickly to things that are arriving that are new to the reserves and removing them before they can take over. So that is part of our process, is kind of making those hard choices about what to focus our attention on.
The next question is also anonymous. I'm going to send this to Gabby, if that's okay. And this is right, in my view, with the great work that the Canadian Council on Invasive Species does to inform and educate people. I would like to know what can be tackled by volunteers with little to no expertise.
For sure, yeah. So there's lots that volunteers can do. I pointed at one of my last slides to Report Canada Invasives.ca, and that's a great resource for people to report invasive species. So citizen science is growing, and it's a really important aspect to invasive species. Essentially that, again, early detection. The earlier we can detect invasive species in our communities, the earlier we can control them before they cause a lot of damage. So I think for volunteering, that's kind of the first route that you can take. And then I would actually recommend that you reach out to your local council. So most of our provinces and territories actually have an invasive species council. You can actually find that through our website. So if you go to CanadaInvasives.ca, you can find it under our chapters, or even at that reporting page I mentioned. And yeah, because a lot of the time they have volunteer events, they have a lot of local things going on. So I would direct you to check that out for sure.
The next question is about the invasive emerald ash borer beetle, and its range has been from Nova Scotia through to Manitoba, and Saskatchewan I know is looking into it right now in terms of a management plan. The question from Kathy is, can anything be done to protect an ash tree from the borer? Which one of you would like to answer that one?
I can help with that one, Andrew, if you'd like.
Sure.
So in one of my previous roles prior to NCC, I worked for the province as a forest health specialist, and one of our first species we've been dealing with was the emerald ash borer. There is actually a product available, a triazine based product available. So if you Google triazine, it is an injectable insecticide where you can save, if you have a really old or really special yard tree, for example, that you'd like to save, there are service providers that can inject the tree that will actually protect the tree from invasion by emerald ash borer. Because the way the borer feeds is actually in the cambium layer underneath the bark of the tree, the layer that actually transmits the water and sugars throughout the tree, and it'll actually inject the insecticide into that particular layer of the tree, and when the emerald ash borer larvae feed there, it does kill the larva and protect the tree that way. So there is some options out there for those individual trees, but unfortunately it's not very cost effective or practical for a large scale situation like a forest.
The next question is from Kim. Her comment and question is, first, thank you so much to everyone for all your work. I missed the very beginning, so my apologies if this was addressed. Is there any work being done to prohibit the sale of invasive species by nurseries, grocery stores, etc.? Is there any legislation? It seems to me that as long as the plants are being sold, the problem will continue to get worse. Gabby and Paula, would either of you like to comment on that one?
I can take a stab at that one. I'm by no means an expert in legislation on that, but from my understanding, it's very provincial focused. So some provinces do have restricted plants. In Ontario, they have an Invasive Species Act where there is prohibited sale of certain species. So that would apply to horticulture plants. It might be different in other provinces, but I'm not completely familiar. And there is other work being done by other groups. I know Invasive Species Council of BC has a really great program. So does the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. And then nationally, the Canadian Council, we have worked on a bee plant-wise program and have worked with the landscape and horticulture industries to develop a horticulture code of conduct, essentially getting horticulture sales and other groups, landscaping groups, to sign on and pledge to sell native and non-invasive plants. So there is kind of work at both, I would say, the legislative and other groups working on preventing that sale, but
Okay, Gabby's internet is freezing up, I think, a little bit.
Definitely a continuing project. Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Just the last 15, 20 seconds, unfortunately, it cut out there a little bit. But Paula, is there anything you wanted to add to that answer?
No, I think Gabby managed to get the most important points out. That yeah, there are some plants that are restricted from being brought into Canada. Unfortunately, things that have been here a long time and have long been available in nurseries, it's a little harder to control those. But yeah, there is work being done by invasive species councils, as Gabby says, to try and work with the industry to minimize that.
The next question is from Karen, and I'll direct this one to you, Paula. It's something that we've heard at the Nature Conservancy of Canada from a media perspective the last 5 or 6 years quite a bit, specifically in Ontario, but other pockets of the country. And Karen's question is, what is being done to get rid of giant hogweed? It seems that it's getting out of control all along highways. Paula, you want to answer about giant hogweed? Because there's a lot of chatter about it every summer. This comes up when people start viewing it along roadsides and trails and bus shelters and you name it.
Sure, yeah, and obviously that plant is a big concern because it can have severe impacts on people. Gabby had mentioned it in her presentation, the sap getting on your skin. It's actually photoactivated, so if you get the sap on your skin and then that's exposed to sunlight, it can cause severe burning, especially concerning for children, of course. There are actually a lot of look-alike species. So where I am here in New Brunswick, we do have a couple of known locations of giant hogweed in the province, but it is very, very rare. And we get probably hundreds of reported sightings of what people think are giant hogweed, and we're very relieved when we are able to go back to the person and say, actually, that is woodland angelica or valerian, often another related, also invasive species, but not as dangerous. So if people do think that they are seeing or are concerned that they might be seeing giant hogweed, I'd really encourage you to report that. You can look up, as Gabby mentioned, on the Canadian Council, there's links to where to report in every province, and get somebody to help you tell you if that is in fact giant hogweed. If it is, then hopefully you can get the council or the municipality involved to control that, so it's not a danger, and put your mind at ease if it's one of those other lookalikes.
Next question is in Quebec and the Laurentians. What can be done to rehabilitate water bodies with overgrowth of algae? Many areas have boat washing stations so that the algae doesn't travel from lake to lake, but what to do about the lakes that have already been affected? Who would like to answer that?
I don't know, I was looking at Eric. I was gonna say I'll jump in, but I'm not an algae expert. Let's make that clear. But I would say, you know, one of the reasons that we find algae blooms in a number of our inland and in the Great Lakes, for that matter, reason is actually due to high levels of nutrients that are flowing into them. So we have kind of a point source problem for a lot of the algae blooms that we see in a lot of these lakes, where there's a lot of phosphorus or nitrogen entering these lakes from upstream land use practices. So it's not always necessarily something that we can control at the bottom end. We really need to work towards a little bit more proactive solutions in controlling the pollutants or the source or the, you know, the minerals and nutrients that are making their ways into these water bodies that are actually encouraging this aggressive algae growth.
In the interest of time, we got a whack of questions here, so we'll try to do a quick fire, answer these as quickly as we can amongst the three of you, if that's okay. Anonymous asks, I was warned against planting Norway maples. Can you address this? Any of you want to take that one on?
Sure. Norway maple is actually quite aggressive of a tree. We found it in the understory, and we're dealing with it on a number of our properties in southern Ontario. It's a very aggressive cedar. It also produces a very large leaf that produces a lot of shade, and so that actually directly impacts the understory and the species that grow alongside it and underneath it in a forest system. So definitely an aggressive tree that seeds very readily, and not one that we want to have on the landscape any more than we have to.
The next one is poison ivy an invasive species? Gabby, do you want to try to answer that one?
Sure. It's not everywhere else in Canada, and it does provide some benefits, not always to humans. We often try to avoid it, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe the berries can be eaten by birds and deer in the forest. So there are benefits to the invasive. No.
Okay. The last question, I guess, and it goes back, it was a question about pest management in Nova Scotia. It was on the screen here a moment ago. What can be done to promote pest management in the forest? I think that was the question, is a concern about how pests may be impacting trees in Nova Scotia. I don't know which one of you would like to talk about that, but I know just last week we announced a project where there's the woolly adelgid in Parr Lake, Nova Scotia, in Yarmouth County, where we bought a piece of land. So we're going to be doing, biological inventories on that piece of property to sort of scope out how widespread that may be. Maybe one of you can talk about that in terms of what's the best practice to sort of see how far a pest may be moving when we first see a piece of conservation land.
Yeah, I can talk really quickly on that. I know we're just about out of time here, but we work Nature Conservancy. I mentioned in my presentation, we're working with a group of government agencies and other interested partners on the hemlock woolly adelgid. Forest pests, particularly in Eastern Canada, the forest industry is such an important industry, and so forest pests tend to be the group of invasives that are that a lot of attention is paid to. But what people can do, people who are watching this webinar, is another one of the programs that the Canadian Council promotes, which is not moving firewood around. That's the best way that individual Canadians can help to prevent these forest pests from damaging our forests. Is if you're going to go camping, enjoy the great outdoors, look for firewood where you are and then burn it where you buy it. Don't bring it home with you. Don't bring it into the woods, and that will help minimize these things moving around our environment.
Thank you, Paula. And unfortunately, we've run out of time for all our questions. We will try to answer them to those folks who have commented in the chat box. Thank you very much for your involvement, and everybody for attending today. Gabby, Paula, and Eric, thank you all for sharing your insights and expertise, and just great stuff, really. If you'd like to provide a comment or a topic suggestion for other webinars, please reach out to us at events@natureconservancy.ca. You can contact us there. For more information on invasive species and how you can help, please visit our website, natureconservancy.ca/invasive species 101. Also, and better yet, you can sign up for our upcoming Big Backyard BioBlitz. It's happening July 29th to August 2nd, and help us identify species wherever you are located. You can register and learn more about that at natureconservancy.ca/2021 BioBlitz to register. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.